Jeg tror, at det var helt musik, men jeg tænker også, at en ting er at være ansvarlig, men en anden ting er sådan, klart, fordi den første tanke er sådan, børnene vil jo gerne have deres forældre har det også, vi kan ikke have for dem, men hvorfor er det selv hvis de alligevel gerne vil være vores det vi rammer, som ikke havde tænkt sig at gøre, det er vigtigt, men hvorfor ved de bedre, hvis de ikke havde tænkt sig at gøre det?
Og så det er bare en dyr projekt.
So proposition is Team Denmark. Okay, I would ask you to change your seats. Because proposition, opposition, we don't want to create any confusion during the debate. So please, if you can switch your positions. Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody in this Octofinal debate of the EurOpen 2016 debate tournament in Hamburg. On the proposition in this Octofinals, we have WSDC Denmark. On the opposition, we have Team USA debate. I would like to congratulate both teams to breaking into Octofinals, and I wish you a good debate. My name is Miha Andrić. I will be your chair judge today. My two wing judges today will be Joke from Germany and Jan from Czech. We will also have the timekeepers who will keep time. So please keep that in mind, that we won't to take care of your time. And I will ask both of the timekeepers after each speech. Please let us know what was the time of speaking. If you don't have any other questions, concerns, or problems, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate for the side proposition.
We get so much from our parents throughout our lives. We get everything from them from a very early age. We owe them our lives. It's time to give back and not leave those old people behind in their houses, dying without anybody knowing. We can give better care. We have a responsibility. We are very proud to propose this motion. So before we get properly into today's debate and get into our constructive, let's first have a little bit of setup and look into the model that we propose on our side of the house. So first of all, we define this house as the entire world, and we define taking care as making sure that these elderly people have housing, food, medical care, basic help, and it's up to the child themselves whether this would mean like an elderly home or whatever they think is best. So we define legally liable as that if you don't live up to these sort of set of rules, you will receive a very major fine, and then the child, no thank you, will be forced to pay for this care if they do not do this in the first place. It will be forced. We define old age as parents who are assessed by the state as unable to completely take care of themselves. And we, of course, also exclude some legal responsibility for people who are not financially stable enough to be able to take care of their parents, or for people, no thank you, who were with, who were victims of abuse their parents are not. who are victims of abusive parents are also
Entschuldigt noch einmal die Störung heute, aber es ist notwendig, denn es gibt einen Raumwechsel für den Schülerrat. Das betrifft alle Klassensprecherinnen und Klassensprecher und alle Jahrgangssprecherinnen und Jahrgangssprecher. Bitte kommt um 12 Uhr im dritten Block in das rote Fachhaus in den Raum 106. Also neuer Raum für den Schülerrat, rotes Fachhaus, Raum 106. Wir freuen uns auf euch.
Responsibility, and they're justified to have this. Okay, so let's first look at like what are our 3 points that we're going to show you today. First of all, we're going to talk about responsibility. Secondly, no thank you, we're going to talk about better care, and thirdly, we're going to talk about money for other things. My second speaker is going to present that point. So let's first of all get into our first point, no thank you, about responsibility. So we believe on this side of the house that children are responsible for their parents. They have a moral obligation to do this. So why are they morally responsible? Well, first of all, parents do so much for their children throughout their entire lives. No thank you. They put them through an education. They make sure they have food. They support them financially for at least 18 years of their lives. And they provide them a complete safety net in their very most vulnerable years. No thank you. Parents and children are so connected and dependent in that way. And a child wouldn't be in this world or be who they are without their parents. So why is this important in the first place? No thank you. Now, when the parents get older, the situation is reversed. Now the parent is going to be the vulnerable one. Now they need the care that they've been giving to their children all their lives. Now it's time for the children to actually have this. So why do the children actually have to do this? But before I'll go on, I'll take a
Just to clarify, are you saying low-income individuals and those that have been abused in the past would be excluded from your plan?
Yes, we said that in our model. We said that this would go to the state care instead. Let's move on. We say, so why do children actually have to do this? So why do they have this responsibility? Well, let's look at how our law system works first of all. We base most of our laws and what we choose to see as legal or correct or not correct on moral responsibility. This is why we have children protection laws, because we believe it's morally right to protect our children. This is why we do have laws about stealing. We believe it's not morally right. In the same way, we should have this responsibility towards our parents, because we have this sort of moral responsibility. Because we base our laws on moral things, this is a moral responsibility that they should give back because of all the things that parents have given to their children. Okay, so let's move into our second argument about the better care that's going to be in the system now. So basically, children have the greatest incentive to actually take care of their parents. First of all, and that also makes them the best care. First of all, because they are the children of their parents. There is going to be a personal bond. They are going to have an incentive to want to take care of their parents because they love their parents. This is very simple. But secondly, no thank you. Secondly, they actually know what's best for their parents because they have this personal bond. They know what the parent would like best. Like me, I'm like, this is going to be whether it's an old people home, whether we want to live with them live with a child themselves. They know better than the state ever will what's going to be best for the child. We see this the same way in the foster care system. And when people talk about, no thank you, about foster care, the parent knows what's best for the child, but at this point in their lives, when parents are older, the child knows what's best for the parent because they know them.
Ma'am, on that.
No thank you. So this is also because now there's also going to be better care. First of all, because the children knows what's best for the parents, but secondly also in just on a state level. Because now, if I, for example, can take care of my parents and I have this sort of financial or just more sort of moral responsibility to take care of my parents and I have that under control, if another person can't do that or doesn't have the financial stability, there is actually going to be more money in the state system because the state doesn't have to worry about my parent because I take care of my parent. I make sure that my parent is safe, but before.
That's exactly the role of the state, to take care of its people, not to force it on the individuals.
Yes, but now the state can do their job even better because there is a responsibility now for the children to take care of their own parents. The parents also take care of their own children. We believe this is sort of the same thing. But I'll go on. Because now that I can take care of, for example, my parent more properly, the other person who maybe can't take care of their parent, or if a parent doesn't have any children to take care of them, and they have to be cared for by the state, they can do their job even better and with even more resources because now they don't have to worry about my parent. They can do this on their own. They're even more independence. So now we're not going to have these elderly people being lost in the system, sitting in their homes, dying without anybody knowing what's happening. So a third sub-point in this is that, of course, now all over the world, and especially in more developing countries, and even with systems that are developed but don't have very good healthcare or system for taking care of the elderly, care is going to be even better under this as well. We see this, like, for example, like I mentioned, and even like with not more systems, like they aren't going to be left behind because the parents, no thank you, are going to have this incentive. In our side of the house, in our world, all of these elderlies we see every year, people who are dying alone in their homes, people who can't get up the stairs in their house but nobody knows about it. All of these people who are being neglected in a system where they're even more elderly for every single year that goes on because of our better standard of life all over the world, they're going to be left behind. And now there is going to be someone who is legally responsible for making sure that these people actively get picked up by the system. So we have even less elderly people who are like neglected by the system, who are hurt by this system, and who aren't taken care of in their most vulnerable years at the end of their lives, who have a good end in their old age because they are taken care of either by their children or even more by a system that has more resources and more money to do this now. We have active, better care on our side of the house in any ways. So because there is this responsibility that we need to take care of, and because we have better care on our side of the house, please, please, please vote proposition. Thank you.
Was 8 minutes and 8 seconds.
Okay, I'd like to thank the first speaker for her fine speech. I would ask all the debaters who are not speaking at the moment on the podium that they keep quiet so they do not bother the other speaker. With this reminder, I'd like to invite the first speaker of the opposition to open the debate for the Team USA debate.
On March 31st of next year, in my country, I will be considered a legal adult. I still won't be responsible enough to have a sip of wine, but the proposition seems to think that I am responsible enough to hold my parents' life in my hand. And because you shouldn't be bound by relationships from birth, we oppose the motion. This House would hold adult children legally responsible for taking care of their parents in old age. I will be doing 3 things in this speech. First, giving you a lens in which to view the round. Second, going against the proposition's first 2 arguments. And finally, giving you the opposition's first 2 arguments, which are first on principle and second practical, while our second speaker will present our third argument on the harshness of reality. But first, giving you a lens in which to view the round. The proposition must show a principal obligation with practical benefits to their side, while the opposition must show why both on principle and practical that this obligation does not exist. But next, looking to the arguments brought up by the proposition. They begin with an extreme example going into their model. Now, there are a few things that are specifically wrong with their model. First, it is not practical. They state that this is applicable to the entire world. They continue to state that in individual cases of abuse, it would be appealed to state governments. Look at individual nations like South Sudan. Probably won't be able to handle all of the cases they would be getting. More specifically, they continue to state that abused or neglected, but specifically, they show no specific way of showing how someone would actually present this type of case. More specifically, this doesn't actually cover estrangement, meaning they don't cover all of the instances that they continue to propose. More specifically, another individual area that is wrong with their model is that they concede that states have responsibility within this system. So specifically, going into their first argument, on the responsibility and moral obligation, they state that children have a moral obligation to provide this care to their parents. First of all, we would argue that the primary moral obligation is from a state. Citizens give up rights so the government will protect them. In the same way, the government should be protecting them in their old age. The state has the primary obligation in today's round. But second, the proposition has failed to recognize a key component of today's debate, and that is with the world of the opposition, Children can choose to care for their parents. They can still choose to provide financial aid. They can still choose to set them up in programs, but they should not be legally binded to do so. More specifically, they continue to go on into detail in their second argument on how it will help care and the professional bond and how children know what their parents need. First of all, me being my parent's child doesn't mean I know what kind of care they need. It doesn't mean that I'm in any way, shape, or form qualified, so they don't actually solve for the impacts they state. But additionally, if children are the ones taking care, it can often go unchecked across the globe. They advocate in their model for each specific country. There is no way each state government can check that each child is giving their parents adequate care, meaning it is impossible within the world of the proposition to solve the harms they are advocating for because there's no individual check. A better alternative is whenever states provide initial care because there's an actual check that this will be ensured. More specifically, this is not helpful care if people resent their parents. Parents are not often going to want care from their children if they are resented and it is not in its best quality, but instead will prefer some type of governmental care that in the world of the proposition just would not be provided. On both the principle and the practical level, the proposition's second argument falls. It is not applicable, it is not feasible, and it is not directly influential like the world of the opposition, where we give citizens and individual children the opportunity to help, but do not force them into situations that they either are not stable enough to handle or just cannot handle as a whole. So going into the first opposition argument, which is why it is principally wrong. There are two layers under this, for parents and children. But first, parents are principally obligated to take care of their children. By and large, parents choose to have their children, meaning they have time to secure some type of resource stability to ensure that their child will be set up. But the obligation doesn't go both ways. Specifically, this indicates that while parents are principally obligated to take care of their children, children do not have the same obligation. Going into our second layer, which is children aren't principally obligated to take care of their parents. Children don't make a conscious choice to be born. Specifically, it is a choice, but it is better to choose if you are going to take care of a parent in old age instead of just being forced. In a legal matter, when you turn 18, you are not categorized with your parents. When you turn into a legal adult, whatever the age may be, you are not categorized with your parents under any type of legality. The same type of situation should stem over into medical care. But specifically, we are showing that the logic needs to go both ways because children aren't principally obligated to take care of their parents. On the principle level, children don't have a primary obligation to take care of their parents, but have the freedom to do so with the world of the opposition. There is not a principal reason for why they need to specifically be forced into this type of care, but I'm sure you disagree.
But in your world, a lot of people just aren't doing it in the status quo. How are you helping all these people?
We are going to be helping people in the status quo by providing them with governmental care and giving people the option. Unlike the world of the proposition, where people are forced into situations that they either can't handle or just won't do without it getting checked, we are actually providing systems of care for the individuals that need it. More specifically, looking specifically at how this individually links to the arguments of the proposition. They state that we have a moral obligation to take care of parents. If an individual child wants to do so, they have the option. But with the world of the opposition, we are not forcing it. This proves that we shouldn't hold adult children legally responsible for taking care of their parents because they don't have the principal obligation to do so. But our second substantive argument is why it is practically wrong. There are two layers under this, a state's job and with young adults. But first, it is a state's obligation to provide this care. The basis of social contract theory, ranging from Locke to Rousseau, indicates that citizens create governments for their own protection. This doesn't only ensure lives, but also ensures a strong quality of life. Citizens create governments in the first place to ensure this kind of life. It is not a child's burden to do so, but the moral obligation of the state. This proves that on a practical level, the obligation should not legally fall on a child, where they will face restrictions that they cannot handle, specifically if they are not able to provide the care that the proposition is ensuring. But our second layer is on young adults, because often young adults aren't financially stable enough to provide the medical care needed for a parent. If you look at someone that just became an adult and is in the middle of paying for mass amounts of schooling to try and have a career, they are most likely not financially capable to pay for the same type of medical care that their parents would want. More specifically, this doesn't This doesn't allow for stable resources to be provided to individuals. Oftentimes, young adults are not financially prepared. They continue to make the argument that this is not applicable. Young adults either aren't financially prepared or knowledgeably prepared as well, and should not be forced into these situations if they don't want to make these decisions depicting the livelihood of their parent. If a parent doesn't want the child to forcibly care, they shouldn't have to. And the same goes for the other way. Ultimately, we have proven to you multiple reasons on both the principle and the practical level for why team opposition is obviously winning on both of these individual sections, and why their unfair model doesn't justify any of their arguments. But even if you don't agree, they all fall because it is not feasible in the real world, and in no way will it solve any of the harsh impacts they continue to propose. So for these reasons, we oppose.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 2 seconds.
Thank you. Okay, I thank the first speaker of the opposition. I would like now to invite the second speaker of the proposition to continue for Team WSDC Denmark.
When living in the debate world, we must look at where we have an impact. Where are we going to make a change through the motion we are proposing? We think they have criticized largely on their side of the house that they're just allowing people to help. We think that on our side of the house, people still, who would help on their side, will still just help, so there's no debate there. People will still just help. We think where we make the difference is for the ones who would not on their side of the house provide help to their elderly. We think this is important. We are so proud to propose. Let's look first at this obligation and this idea that we have. Now, we presented to you the moral obligation that we have to our parents for taking care of us and how they supported us through our lives. We presented to you in our model that if you have been abused and your parents have broken this contract that they have with you, both morally and legally, then you do not have that obligation to them. Now, we think, though, also you have sort of a monetary obligation because your parents have poured so much into you. We think it is only fair that the state requires that you pour something back into them. Now let's clear up the model a little bit because I know there was an announcement under it, so let's just make it very, very clear. We defined old age as once your parents are not physically able to care for themselves anymore. We think that it's an extreme mischaracterization, no thank you, to insist that an 18-year-old is going to have to care for their 45-year-old parent. That's absolutely ridiculous. No thank you. We think that in the cases where a parent, for example, falls ill to a disease, then the other parent would still take care of them. There are other people who are still there. We don't think we would hold an 18-year-old legally responsible. We think an adult person is someone who has lived their life, who now has the monetary ability. No thank you. Let's talk about how the state, we still have state care on our side. We think that we would just have people pay for the state care. We think that in the cases where people are extremely poor, we would have the state do it because the state still cares for poor people. We give welfare to people who are poor. It'd just be absolutely silly to give poor people money to then care for their parents. We think we just do this already on their side, and we think that's just the model cleared up for them. Now, let's look at this better care that we offered on our side of the house. Now, we told you that children in most cases have the best incentive to take care of their parents. We think this stands in the majority of cases. Now, let's have look at the minority of cases where children don't have a connection to their parents. We still think that by legally obligating to have them pay, you don't have to go and visit your parent every day, but it removes some of the responsibility from the state. We'll talk about why this is so important in our third argument. Because we agree that a state has an obligation to citizens, but we think a state also fulfills obligation through laws, such as these. We think that a state has obligations to many people in the citizen, and we think that by putting this burden on only old people is incredibly unfair, because when your child is able to do this, when the child is able to fulfill this role, we think it is better for them to do that and the state to focus on other obligations. Would you disagree?
Team opposition is not saying that old people should have to care for them by themselves. We say that it's the state obligation to help the neediest, not force it on other individuals.
We think that the state obligation... Wait, sorry, can you repeat the question?
We are not saying that old people would solely care for themselves, but instead it's the state's obligation to care for the needy, no matter what, not force it on other people.
So we think that the state's obligation is to make sure everyone is cared for. We don't care which mechanism this is done through. We think the state has a much larger portion of people than just the old to care for. We think there's also like refugees, there's also like people who are living under the poverty line. We think the state has obligation to these people too, and we must also look at this. Our side provides a mechanism where the state is better able to fulfill these duties while still caring for the old people. We think this is very important to look at. Now, they are also just mischaracterizing the world as a world where everyone is getting care, where every elderly person is getting care. We think we are finding a way to enforce that all old people have like a decent quality of life within their old age. Let's move into my constructive point, no thank you, which is about how we have more money for other things. 2 subpoints: why it's so expensive to care for older people, and secondly, why there's more money, why the money is more important in other places. Here will also clash directly with why it's like the state obligation. So firstly, why is it so expensive? So, like in this case, we have to look at 2 worlds because like there's very different systems of welfare within the world. Let's first look at like a universal system like Sweden or Denmark, where like welfare is like included for all people. We think that like currently there's a huge disproportion of people who are old and people who are young. This means very soon a lot of old people will be leaving the job market and there'll be very few young people actually paying taxes. This is going to be a huge burden on the welfare system. It's going to cause a collapse. Why is this harmful? Because the welfare system doesn't just take care of old people. They're living in a world where the state only has an obligation to old people. Now, what else do we use welfare money for? No, thank you. We use it for poor people. We use it for foster children. We use it to help humanitarian aid. We use it to solve environmental crises. We think it's very important that we have other things that we can fulfill. So it's very, like, we'll talk about this more in the second point.
Ma'am.
No, thank you. Okay, so like, what about the non-universal welfare states? Again, like, we think this is lower impact here because here it is more private systems, like it's where like the people will take care of their own parents, but the state still does take care of some old people here. And we think like, firstly, we told you in our second point, which we didn't have a response to, like when there's less people the state has to take care of, the quality of the care goes up. So we think this is a benefit on our side of the house because there's actually just less. But also like, we still have the same effect. The state is able to like have a smaller budget on elderly and is able to go to other places. So what we're concluding with in this point is that it's very expensive for society to take care of the elderly because it's a growing number of them, and it will continue to be so because people are having less and less children. Second subpoint, why is money so important elsewhere? Here we're going to look specifically at other state obligations. So where else does the state have obligations? A state has obligations also what people voted them in for. So we see that like a large majority of people are very unhappy when a large portion of money goes to the elderly. How are we solving this? We are now putting responsibility onto the child. We told you already why we have like this moral responsibility and why we have like the monetary responsibility. We think that it's okay to make laws on this. As we told you in response to, we base laws off of moral ideas. So we think it's okay to base another law off of this. Now, like how is the state also spending money? The state also spends money like on poor people. Why are these more important? Because if we can help lift these people out of poverty, they're going to bring growth to us. They're going to bring like different things into society that's very important to us. So we think it's very important to solve this. We also think it goes to like humanitarian aid, and the state has an obligation to also help solve this. But why is the state role different? Like we think that when like a state has an obligation to its citizens, it's not just a very small portion of it as they're painting it as, like they're painting it as only obligation to these small number of people. We think it's to everyone, and that's very important. We think it's especially important when we have a very limited number of resources within the world, and then we have to believe that it's a state obligation to take care of what is most important. In this case, we think elderly care is important, but we think it can be firstly better done by a private person, and secondly, it could also like by giving the responsibility over to other people, it also allows the state to fulfill its obligation of other things that are more important, such as humanitarian aid, refugee crisis, and other things. All right, let's sum up what we told you. We've told you that their picture of the world is absolutely ridiculous, where every elderly person is receiving care. We think we help those who don't receive care on our side, we increase the quality of care overall for everyone, and we allow the state to fulfill its obligation not only for the elderly, but for everyone. We think it's very important that the state has the ability to do this, and we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaking time was 7 minutes and 45 seconds.
May I thank the second speaker for her fine speech. Now I'd like to invite a second speaker of the opposition to continue for Team USA debate.
Let's compare the world of team proposition and team opposition. On team proposition, they tell you all children are loved and all children love their parents. We think that's a nice thought to have. But quite frankly, on team opposition, we don't exactly think is true, something I'll get into a bit later. But then they also further and say that under their world, taking care of your parents would mean you provide housing, food, medical care. Well, on the world of team opposition, we think that sounds quite familiar. Why? Because those are the exact things the state's supposed to provide for its most needy, which is why we tell you on team opposition that this is the role that a state should be fulfilling. They should not be forcing this on the task of their individuals, something team proposition has continued to refuse to engage with. But, so a few things in this speech today. First, just going over what should have been considered on team proposition, then rebutting with them, then like refuting some of the attacks they made on our case, and lastly delivering our third substantive arguments. So let's look at what team proposition had offered at the top of their case. First, they tell you about this thing. When it comes to their model, they would be excluding abused people that have been abused in the past and also low income. So on people that are abused, like we say, we don't think this is actually going to be practical. We don't understand how a state is going to be able to like pinpoint these people and come to conclusion that they shouldn't have to care for their parents, something team proposition doesn't engage with, because quite frankly, we don't think there's a mechanism to do that. And if there is one, we would say it's quite damaging to the individual to force them to literally relive the abuse they've had in the past. But then moreover, when it comes to like the low income people being excluded, we grant them that. But moving on, let's go over to their first point where they talk about responsibility children have. They say that parents do so much for you and therefore children are always obligated to do the same. On the world of team opposition, we think that's a nice thought to have, but that's not exactly what reality looks like. We understand that there are instances in the past where yes, children are abused, and even if you take them at their highest ground and say they don't count in this round today, we still think there are instances where some children obviously have rough relationships with their parents. Maybe they're not physically abused, but we still think they probably face some type of trauma that means that they don't have the good relationships that team proposition seems to think every family has. But then moreover, they talk to you about this idea about the laws are based on morals. Quite frankly, we think when it comes to how governments actually work, they're not moral actors. We have to be looking at this, how is this going to be done practically? We think it's more the state's practical obligation to provide for the needy, rather than talk about moral ideas that they kind of explain vaguely. But then going to their second argument, where they talk about children providing this care means it's going to be better care in the long run. First, they tell you, once again, that children love their parents, therefore they know what's best for them. I guessed when I turn 18 and I'm going to know the best healthcare options for my parents far better than a professional. We think that's quite illogical and absurd. But then moreover, like Sarah brings up in her own speech, she says it's a lot more efficient when you have the state streamline the process, have regulations, have checks, actually conducting the type of things that are needed, not simply allowing like people to choose for that. They don't truly engage with that in their last speech. We think that if you're to let this go unchecked, it's not going to be the better care that they tell you it's going to be. But then secondly, they tell you this, well, you're going to have better care, because if you take some of the burden off of the state, that means obviously they can focus on better stuff. Okay, that might sound nice and it might sound true to agree, but what we would say is, once again, it's the obligation of the state to provide these things. We say yes, obviously they have other obligations too, but quite frankly, we don't think they should be pushing their obligations onto their people. We think this just leads to the same type of actions, the same type of logic in the long run. But before I continue,
in a lot of systems, you also have to pay for things such as education. Isn't that also the state pushing an obligation onto parents to do something that should be their job?
We would say when it comes to how a state truly should act, they should probably be providing education for all of its citizens so you have the most productive society. But then going back to what I was saying, they tell you about this idea about, once again, the state's going to be have a better sector. We think when you actually allow people to choose to help your parents, that's when you get the best care. And even if you buy them at their highest ground, that there's not enough people choosing, we still think, once again, it's the obligation of the state to provide these types of things, which brings me to their third argument about how taking care of elderly people is a lot of money. First of all, we think it's actually kind of morally wrong if we're talking about morals like Team Proposition wants to, that you would actually like push this burden off of the state and say like, well, elderly people, while we have a lot of problems, while caring for them is a problem, it doesn't really matter that much to us, so we're just going to push it off to somebody else. We think that's morally corrupt. Hold them to that. But then second, if you truly want to solve these other problems like elderly population growing too big or like the refugee crisis, you know, Europe could take in more refugees, which would solve both of those issues. We don't really think that's the problem of the motion. The motion should have been about if we should be forcing this type of act upon adult children. But then going down over our case. Unfortunately, our friends from Denmark have seemed to only engage with the case on Team Opposition that we don't actually bring up. They provide surface level analysis at best, which I'll be getting into. On our first argument where we talk about the principle of the debate, we tell you there's a fundamental difference between the role of a parent and the role of a child. We tell you the reason why a child does not have an obligation to their parents is one, they didn't choose to have their parents in the first place, but then second, if you look at on a legal matter, once you turn 18, like in most countries, you're an adult, you're no longer connected to your parents, so we don't think it makes, in a legal sense, why you would force them to continue to be a part of that when we don't see that in the rest of like legal matters as well, something they haven't engaged with at all. But then going on to the second level, the second argument we bring up about the practical level, we tell you about how once again, it's the states' rights. They just tell you states have other obligations that they should probably focus on. Once again, we think they can do both of those, and it's morally wrong to say elderly people aren't as important of an obligation. But then secondly, we tell you about how this burdens children that are younger as well. They tell you the only thing, well, we're not talking about 18-year-olds or 45-year-old parents. Okay, even if you grant them at their highest ground, that's going to be older adults, we still think there might be people out there that are in their 20s that truly do not have the life experience to hold the lives of their parents in their hand and be responsible for that. They don't engage with us on that level at all. But then going to our last substantive argument, which is that we have no obligations to the sins of our fathers. Once again, they tried to tell you that we're not talking about children that have been abused in the past, but we still think it's important to talk about, and we still think there are still children that might not have been physically or emotionally abused, but still suffer broken relationships that they had. We think that relationships are hard. Families are not perfect like Team Proposition would like you to think, which is why we say that it is wrong to tell these people that now they have to take care of the people that have abused them in the past, the people that have set trauma on them in the past, and have made broken relationships. We think it's morally just corrupt to do that in the first place, and Team Proposition would tell you, well, those things don't matter. So, when the round comes to a close, what do we see on Team Proposition? We see a model that doesn't seem very practical and seems flimsy at its best, but then moreover, when it comes to their actual arguments, when they talk about morality, they seem to be the ones that are being more immoral when they tell you that elderly people are just not that big of a problem, we should push it on to somebody else. Us on Team Opposition understand that the role of a state is to always protect its needy. Yes, we understand that there are other obligations, but these obligations, progress is never going to happen when we refuse to actually help other people and when we refuse to continue to engage with them, which is why we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speaking time was 7 minutes and 42 seconds.
Okay, I thank the second speaker of the opposition. Now I'd like to invite the last constructive speaker on the proposition to continue for WSDC Denmark.
Everyone ready? Mr. Speaker, let's take this debate back into the real world, because they refuse to argue this debate on our terms. We told you very clearly from the beginning, this debate takes place in the whole world. And now let's look at these different parts of the world and why they have to be part of the debate and why we're winning on them. So first of all, let's look at the developing world, which they completely refuse to regard as a part of this debate. And now why is this so important? It's because it's really important that somebody has a responsibility, because as they said themselves, these countries can't provide state care. They can't do all these things for their citizens as they're modeling it, like their model is that they should do. So like their whole counter argument falls. But now what happens on our side is that it's much easier for a state to just check that their citizens are doing it, or like make sure that they're doing this. So it's easier for a state that doesn't have all the monetary incentive to do it, to check that their citizens are doing that job. So in that way, they're making sure that this is happening when they don't have the monetary funds to do so themselves, therefore providing the obligation. Second of all, we tell that in the worst case, not all countries will be able to do the checks, not all countries will be able to do this. At the worst case, these just becomes a wash in the debate. They do not go to side opposition because all their argumentation is on, is on states providing care. They cannot do that in all of these countries. We're winning on them already because they have not engaged. But now let's look at the developed world. Because they're trying to paint this picture as all countries that are having state care, all countries get free education. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's just not what is happening in the status quo, and they haven't responded to like how they will actually be doing this. Like, will they be enforcing this? How will they do in terms of political backlash? People don't want this in the status quo. This is not the wish of the people because they understand that some things are best left to the citizens. Okay, so now that this is being cleared up, let's look at this debate in two aspects. First of all, who has the responsibility? And second of all, what side provides better care? So first of all, let's look at responsibility, because this has been a very debated issue. Okay, so we tell you from the get-go that there's a moral responsibility to give back to your parents because they've given you so much, now it's a reverse situation. What we get from them is that, no, the obligation lies with the state. So let's tackle this idea of the obligation lying with the state, right? Because we tell you, first of all, the obligation that lies with the state is just to ensure that they get this care. We tell you, under our side of the house, they're still doing that obligation because they're still ensuring that they're getting that care. That's the obligation that they have. But we tell you, furthermore, the obligation of the state is then fulfilled under that side of the house. But second of all, we tell you that the obligation also lies with the individual, because in a lot of senses, the individual has obligation towards one another. They have obligations, such as a parent has an obligation to their child to take care of them when they're under 18. The same goes for children, because they haven't provided any analysis on how that's different, because we recognize in some cases individuals have responsibility over others, such as with parents. But now let's look at why our moral point still stands, because we tell you that laws, which they haven't really responded to this analysis, right? Because what we tell you is that laws are usually based on morale, right? So, for example, in the terms of stealing, we make laws based on morale when we see that this is not being upheld and this is hurting society. So we tell you that the reason this needs to be a law is because, first of all, it's morally correct. But second of all, it's because this is not happening in the status quo. It's not enough just to say you have a moral responsibility because they're not doing it in the status quo. That's why it needs to be made into a law. And that's why we make laws. It's because it's not just enough to say it's morally wrong to steal. We have to tell you it's actually wrong. You're going to be punished for stealing, because that's the only way we get people to uphold it. They haven't dealt with that because all they tell us really to moral responsibility is that, well, children can still just choose to do it. We tell you, first of all, yes, they're still doing it under our side of the house. So that example, really also falls to our side of the house. But we tell you the real debate is to be had at the people who wouldn't do it otherwise, because they're the person that's going to be changed. And they're the person we're making sure does it. So what they then tell us is, well, it's wrong for people who had a really bad relationship with their parent to make them do it. First of all, we tell you that in terms of abuse, which they've harped upon, is first of all, we tell you abuse is removed. Yes, we can see the abuse. For example, have they been removed from their parents at a young age because they're being sexually abused? Have they filed lawsuits? There are a lot of ways we already see this in the legal system. But we tell you, furthermore, if you don't have an amazing relationship to your parent, that doesn't really matter. You can choose to put them in a state home. You don't have to care for them in your own house. But furthermore, if a parent doesn't like their child, it doesn't mean that they don't have to care for them. Your feeling is not that important in terms of that, but we tell you, regardless, it's still the minority of the cases. But now let's look at how we provide. And lastly, let's look at the fact that the parents choose to have children and they don't. We tell you that, first of all, you cannot disregard everything that you've gotten from your parents. Regardless of the fact that I didn't choose to get it, I still got it, so you can't throw all that away. So a lot of the analysis still stands just because you got it. It's not necessarily because you chose to got it. You got it anyway. And no, thank you. So because of that, you've still gotten all these things. It doesn't matter if you chose to get it. It matters that you got, and now you have to pay back. Okay, now look at the second theme. Because now we've clearly proven to you why we need this law and why it's the morally correct thing to do. Okay, so here we're going to look at how we actually best care for the citizens, because this is also very important, right? So first of all, we tell you that we'll have better care under our side of the house because now children are paying. Everybody will get this care, right? That's the first major benefit that they've not proven. In the developed world, in the developing world, where parents are literally, like most people live off of agriculture, right? When you can't go out and farm your land, you're not going to get food, right? So we tell you we win on those, but we win because now everybody's getting this care, because yes, it's great that states in some way will give them care. Like, we're just like, we have to prove that everybody gets care, and that's what we do. Then they tell us, well, we'll just neglect the people and we won't go check up on them. Like, no, we'll still have checks on our side of the house. We still have to check that they're doing it right. Otherwise, how could we hold them legally responsible to be doing the actual best care? Okay, now let's look at why we think that the children are the best at choosing how to get care. Because we tell you, what they really basically only answer to this is, well, like, I don't know at 18, like, what my parents like, right? We tell you that you don't have to, like, know what they like the best in a minute. We tell you that you can put them in a care facility where professionals will take care of them if you don't feel like you're confidently being able to take care of them, right? Let me take your PY.
You keep talking about the morality of our actions, but how is it moral for the government to tell elderly people that they are not important enough to be taken care of by the state?
We're telling you that the government is exactly telling the elderly people that they're important, because the government is still making sure that they're getting care. We're telling you the government is still enforcing the best care. We're telling you that they're actually enforcing a better care on our side of the house. So it's not the government not telling them that it doesn't matter. It's the government telling them exactly how much they matter. That's really important. Because we tell you also, which they haven't really responded to, is this will also get better care for everybody who can't get care, who doesn't have children or like can't get there, because there will be a less strain on the system. Because what's really important and what they haven't really tackled is what we brought up in our third argument, which is like right now a lot of countries, like the population is aging. There's so many old people. Like, this will be a massive strain on the system, and this means that they won't be able to provide the optimal care. Like, their care will go down if they're supposed to be able to afford it, but we're not doing that on our side of the house because we're dividing the burden, right? So there will still be better care. Lastly, let's just look at the young adults, because they're basically basing the whole case upon like 18-year-olds will have to take care of the parents. We tell you that that's a minority of the cases. Don't let them run away with that. But second of all, we tell you that if they don't have the monetary funds to do so, that falls out, because obviously you don't have to do it if you can't afford. So we've said that. But furthermore, we tell you that there still lies a moral responsibility to do so if you can, regardless of what age you're at. So because we prove that we get better care on our side of the house, because we're the side that stands on the moral high ground, and because we prove that it needs to be made legal to make sure that everybody follows the right morale, I've never been more proud to stand beside Proposition.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 24 seconds.
I thank the third speaker of the proposition. I would like to invite the last constructive speaker in this debate, the third speaker of the opposition.
All right, is everybody ready? And I'll begin. One of my good friends at school has been physically abused for much of her life. The world of the proposition seems to think it's pretty easy for abuse victims to just come forward and be listened to and talk about their conditions without any concerns. But the reality is, every time my friend talks about what happens to her, it's a new blow. It's a new pain. But furthermore, the state can't determine what is or is not abuse in every scenario if people are willing to come forward, because it's different for each person. Because we don't believe that family is forced, we are proud to oppose. In this speech, I'm going to do a few things. First, I'll cover the model. Second, I'll spend a brief amount of time looking at the lens through which we should view this round. And then third, I'll ask you 3 questions. First, who's principally correct? Second, who helps the children? And third, who helps elderly parents? Now, let's start with the model. First, on the issue of abuse. Now, we give you a few reasons why this is really impractical that Colette illustrates beautifully. First, we tell you that a lot of people aren't comfortable coming forward with their abuse, especially as children, so saying just people who are taken away from their parents are going to be believed is a little ludicrous. But second, there's this thing we call in psychology re-traumatization, which is where when people are forced to explain their abuse over and over again, it worsens the abuse abuse, and that's really harmful. But third, Colette tells you that even if you take them at their highest ground, and this is implemented, there are still people who are neglected or abandoned that wouldn't be considered abused, but have no obligation to their parents. Even if you take them at their highest ground, that part of the model is infeasible, but you disagree.
Ma'am, the minority of cases are these ones who are being abused, and we agree that's still going to be a harm on both sides. But you, in the status quo, are not providing care to everyone. Can you please respond to how you do this on your side?
Ma'am, it is not true that the majority of abuse cases are handled well and reported, but furthermore, we tell you that it is better for the state to take care of people and streamline things than to force it on children. I'll get to that specifically in a minute. But there are other, they're like only response to young parents and this idea of old ages. Well, all of our parents are probably 45. First of all, I would tell you that, for example, my dad's 65 years old. If he were to get early onset Alzheimer's, I would be responsible. That's ludicrous. But furthermore, Colette tells you, even if you take them at their highest ground, there's still individuals in their early or late middle or late 20s who would be forced to care for their parents that can't make the best decision. But furthermore, they make this argument that there are states with governments that can't provide for their people. At that level, if those states are so impoverished, it makes literally no sense that their people would be able to care for their parents. Furthermore, they couldn't fulfill their part of the model where the state picks up the slack when the kids aren't able to. That doesn't make sense. But now, let's talk about the lens through which we view the round. We should be looking at who has the moral responsibility to take care of the child. Just saying, oh, your parents took care of you is not enough to prove that that overrides the inherent burden that a state has to its people about what versus the role of a parent and a child. Now, the first question that you have to ask yourself in today's round is who is principally correct. Now, one of the first things we discussed is whether a child has a responsibility to their parents because the parents take care of them. Now, first of all, note that they themselves say that the state should be picking up the slack and caring for parents. We agree, but what we say instead is that because governments are meant to protect their people, not just to throw protection at other individuals, that the state should be caring for individuals as a whole. But furthermore, we tell you that it's inherently different, because while parents consent to care for a child, none of us chose to be born. We didn't buy into this contract, but furthermore, it's just false that all parents pay for their child. My dad never paid a cent for me in his life. He forwarded a $5 check to my mom so he wouldn't have to do that. Should I have to pay thousands of dollars to take care of him? Probably not. But furthermore, we discuss the role of a parent and a child, and they don't actually engage with the difference between these roles. All they say is that you owe their parents because they take care of you. But remember, first of all, it's principally different because of what you consent to do. But furthermore, even if you take them at their highest ground and you recognize that a lot of people aren't going to choose, and that's a big burden on the state, we tell you that it's still better to let those individuals who choose to take care of their parents and let the other individuals be taking care of the state, because the state can streamline the process of care and the state will treat them better and children will be resentful. That's not a high quality of care. But furthermore, we tell you that right now people aren't forced to care for their parents, and many still do. The state's not collapsing because of the burden it has on elderly people. But furthermore, we talk about the role of the state, and the only engagement that they give you with this is they say, well, the state has other obligations. But first of all, those other obligations aren't what the debate is about. Their third substantive just says, oh, we'll have more money for refugees. But as Colette says, not only is this not at the heart of the motion, but the state could solve this in other ways. For example, Europe could solve its aging crisis by letting in young refugees. That's not what we're discussing, and they themselves say to focus on the world, but they focus on European welfare states. That's a little hypocritical. But the second question that you have to ask yourself in today's round is who helps children? Now, the first thing we talk to you about is bad parents. Now, again, not every individual is going to come forward and discuss this, but also, as Colette addressed, there are situations where people have bad relationships with their parents or neglectful relationships that wouldn't be covered under their model, even if you take them at the highest ground. For example, there are a lot of parents who walk away from their children. That's not classified as abuse of any definition, but what can still cause is a lot of emotional harms and breaks their idea that you have any financial obligation to your parent. It doesn't make sense. They don't neglect this part of our argument, engage with this part of our argument, which Colette brings up early on. All they say is that, well, children who are abused and were taken away, we'll cover them. That doesn't address our actual argument. It just addresses what they wish our argument was. But the second thing that we talk about is the issue of young adults. Again, literally their only engagement with this is to say, well, some choices choices can be made for you at an old folks home, and our parents are probably pretty young. But again, it's still a lot of stress for young adults. Most of them aren't informed enough to make the decision in the first place about whether their parents should be in an old folks home or should be taken care of by them. But furthermore, a lot of these children don't know how to handle their money responsibly, and the state doesn't cover how you handle your money. They're in their model, it just covers whether you're able to afford it or not. But furthermore, we tell you that not only are children able to make uninformed decisions, but furthermore, it's a lot of stress to put on a young person, to force them to put their life on hold, to take care of an ailing parent. The state, on the other hand, it's their job to take care of people who are ailing. It's their job to care for them. All they say is, well, the state makes laws to uphold morality, and while that's true, that's not exclusive with the idea of the state having a social contract to care for its people. But you disagree.
You're talking a lot about the hard choices that these young people have to make. Well, most of it is just due to the unfortunate situation. They still have to decide where they're getting care. A lot of the state doesn't make all the decisions. Please explain the distinct harms that happen because of our model.
Because a lot of people don't know how to make decisions that informed actors and professionals who are part of the state can make, rationally speaking. But the third question you have to ask yourself in today's round is who helps elderly parents? Now, first we tell you about the bad choices. Again, a lot of individuals aren't always informed about the best way to care for their parents, even if they choose to care for them. Even if you take them at their highest ground, we tell you that the state is a better actor because not only is the process streamlined, but it's their job to do so. But furthermore, we tell you help the quality of care because not only is it better when the state handles this because it's more streamlined, but we tell you when people consent to care for their parents, even if you believe them and you say that it's a minority, you see better care in the long run because people are choosing to do this. People will treat their parents well. At best, their checks and balances happen occasionally when you're checking on all these families. At worst, you believe what they say, and a lot of states can't handle the burden of parents, and you don't see these checks happening. If you believe in quality of care, you believe in choice.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 4 seconds.
I would like to thank the third speaker, and I would like to invite the reply speakers to conclude this debate. First, the reply speaker for the opposition.
Remember what we told you from the beginning, down the bench, that what team proposition needed to do was prove why there is a principal obligation and a practical reason of why we would adopt their world. We don't think they really prove why an obligation exists, but moreover, we don't think they actually engage with us on the debate between the individual and the state's obligation when it comes to what's in the round. So, with that being said, I'll be looking at this debate on why team opposition has won on a principle and a practical level. So going to the principle, team proposition tells you, well, it's the child's responsibility to take care of their parents because conversely, their parents took care of them. We think that's kind of a naive way to look at the world, but if we're going to take them on their highest ground, we still think there's a fundamental difference between the role of a parent and the role of the child. Like we tell you, children do not choose to have their parents, and then when we look at this on a legal matter, once you turn to be an adult, you're separated from your parents. This means it doesn't make sense to continue to force this arbitrary connection when in a legal sense it doesn't exist, something they've refused to engage upon. But then second, we tell you there's a greater obligation on the state side. We say if kids want to take care of their parents, go ahead, but we still think there's a greater reason why the state has to be taking care of their needy. They just tell you, well, we still fulfill this because the state provides for people when they can't do it. We say that's great. That's exactly what states are supposed to be doing. They should be taking care of their needy, but moreover, we think it's actually very immoral for them to say that, well, it's going to be a lot more efficient. It lessens the state's burden when they don't have to care about elderly people. They continue to not engage us on this fact, but still want to perpetuate this idea that they're being the moral actors in the round. We think what a state should be doing is, yes, they have a lot of problems. There's a lot of obligations they have to fulfill, but that does not mean they can force them onto the people. They don't actually tell you why the state has the right to force this onto the people. We continue to tell when we make governments, when we enter into social contracts, it's because we are trying to ensure that, yes, our priorities, our rights are going to be protected. That's the obligation of the state, something they really haven't touched touched on. Because what we think is when you allow this to happen, when you allow the state to push obligations onto people, it's not actually going to fix the problems they bring up, like the refugee crisis in the future, because the state's going to think, well, we can just push these burdens onto somebody else because we've done that before. But then, lastly, under this, we think, once again, it's wrong to force people that have been in hurt relations or abuse to do this. Even if you don't buy the abuse, even if you think that still doesn't exist on their ground, we think it's still very true to say that broken relationships exist, even if there isn't physical abuse. They don't engage with this on that. But then going to the more practical level, let's take them at their highest ground, where they see the debate should be about the people who choose to not help their parents. We think, okay, but even if you force them to do this, it doesn't create better care because, one, you don't really provide a way of how you would actually check this. The only response to this comes a little late in the third speech about how they would still have regulations. We think it's better to leave that at the hands of the professionals rather than the discretion of people that are being forced into something that they don't want to do. But then moreover, we tell you, it's actually a lot better to have people that choose to want to do this so that they can provide what they think is the best care when it comes to like what professionals do, rather than once again forcing people that literally do not want to be in this position at all. There's no way to actually see if they are providing the care that they talk about. Their engagement comes far too late in the round. But then moreover, we tell you that we shouldn't be holding people that are intellectually immature to do this. They tell you, well, you're just talking about like 18-year-olds with their parents at 45. No, we think it's still better to have the government fulfill their role of protecting the needy when it comes to elderly people, not having confused 20-year-olds trying to figure out just how to do life in general, try to have the lives of their parents in their very own hands. So, when the round comes to the close, if we both agree that majority of children do care for their parents and will provide that help, we would say it's better on team opposition to gain the benefits from that, but not see the harms of forcing people into doing something they don't want, but then letting the government get away from pushing their burden, their very obligation as a state onto the people. So don't let them tell you we're only talking about 18-year-olds and people don't care. We make it very clear about what we tell you on team opposition, that it's far better to allow people to choose and make the state fulfill its obligation. Thank you.
Speaking time was 4 minutes and 5 seconds.
Okay, I thank the last speaker for US debate team, and now I'd like to invite the reply speaker for WSDC Denmark to conclude this debate.
Ladies and gentlemen watching today's debate, we have two worlds that we're arguing together. But on side opposition's world, there is a huge problem that is left unfixed. On our side of the house, we actually have a solution for this problem. We are actively making the world better. So let's look at how this functions and how this has been looked at in today's debate. So, the two major themes that have been looked at in today's debate is, of course, the moral obligation that exists, and of course, the better care and the improvement of the society that exists. So let me show you how we actually have that on our side of the house, and how it doesn't work on their side of the house. Let's just look at how today's debate has gone. So let's look at the worlds. On their side of the house, they believe that every single parent is going to be okay. Every single parent going into old age is going to be fine. They don't even engage with properly or even consider the thousands of elderly people that every single year are neglected by the system that exists. In their word, the status quo is absolutely perfect. There doesn't even exist a problem. On our side of the house, we actually acknowledge that there is this problem. We've shown you and we've told you that there is a problem with neglect. And we've shown you exactly how we solve this problem. We solve this problem with a legal obligation that is backed up by the moral obligation. So let's look at this moral obligation, because we told you that there actually exists a moral obligation. We told you how when everything that is given to a child when everything that a parent gives to a child also comes back, and that there is some reciprocity. We've shown you on our side of the house how laws are based on moral obligation. This is something that they didn't even engage with on their side of the house in today's debate. We've shown you that when we actively make laws, we do it because of a moral. We've shown you that we have this moral because when these parents get into an older age, there is still a bond. On their side of the house, they would completely neglect any kind of bond that there exists between parent and child and just say that it doesn't even matter anyway because everything only exists on a legal level. Well, we have laws that are based on moral. As I've already said, we have laws that are made legal because of morality. Now, they also try to fit today's debate into a very, very narrow view. And they only, in their last couple speeches, focused very, very heavily on the abusive children, on the children that were abused by their parents. We believe this is a very narrow view of today's debate. And the fact that there's one example, and we've told you that there are checks for this. We've told you that there are checks for when people are abused. And we've told you that these, in our very first speech, in our model, we pointed out that these would not be included. We'd like to make that very clear, but they still put this down as the very narrow view to put in today's debate. We've also told you, so let's look at the actual better care that it's provided on our house, which we have proven. We have both the moral obligation and the benefits that come with that. We have on our side of the house a state that actively fulfills its obligation through a law. That's how states often fulfill their obligations. Parents, as we've told you, parents also care for their children and fulfill an obligation, but still also care independently for their children without, and that still has, a state still has its responsibility to children. We've told you this before. We've told you how the state still fulfills its obligation. But not only that, we're actively solving a problem. We're solving all of these elderly people that we've told you about, that we put into a picture for you. We get so that when nobody's there to care for them, there's somebody actually picking this up. There is an obligation to have these people picked up and get taken care of in their old age. This is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the better care because the burden is relieved over several different sectors because this is also done in the third and developing world. And also because we just get these people a good life at the end of the day. So please, please, for the elderly, for the humanity, please vote side proposition.
I thank the last speaker. I thank all the debaters for this fine debate. You now can shake your hands. And I'd like to say one big thank for this great debate, and then I'll ask you to leave the room. You can go to the auditorium, we'll come to a decision, and the decision will be announced later in the auditorium. Thank you very much for the debate.